Prior to the early years of the 20th century, Japan had failed to give serious consideration to children's literature. One of the earliest examples was doyo, poetry and nursery rhymes that can be traced back to the publication of Akai Tori, Red Bird, a children's magazine launched in July 1918. At the height of its popularity, one young woman elevated the doyo genre to new heights. Celebrated poet Saijo Yaso described her as the brightest star among all the young writers of poetry for children, highlighting her unique and precious sense of imagination. Her name was Misuzu Kaneko. And despite the rare combination of public popularity and critical praise, in 1930, she took her own life at the age of 26. For 50 years after her premature death, she was largely forgotten. But in 1984, 3 notebooks, containing up to 512 poems by Misuzu, were discovered by the children's author Setsuo Yazaki. Since then, Misuzu Kaneko's poems have been translated into 11 languages and have become popular worldwide, transcending ethnicity, religion, and ideology. In this video, we'll explore why this innovative poet took her own life at such a young age, and along the way, we'll introduce some of the poems that still resonate with children and adults around the world. Our story begins in Yamaguchi Prefecture, at the westernmost tip of Japan's largest island, Honshu. To the southwest, the port of Shimonoseki was ideally placed to become a gateway to China and Korea. It was here that an enterprising businessman, called Matsuzo, established a thriving international chain of bookstores that bore his name. His wife, Fuji, was the younger sister of Michi, who lived at the opposite end of the prefecture, in the small fishing town of Senzaki, on the northeast coast, where they both grew up. Michi's husband, Shonosuke, worked for her brother-in-law and managed a store in China, which meant he was often away from home. Michi and Shonosuke had 3 children. Kensuke, their first son, was the eldest. In 1903 came Misuzu, followed a short time later by her younger brother, Masasuke. In 1906, the family heard that their father would not be returning home again after he was murdered in China. Matsuzo helped his widowed sister-in-law to open a small bookshop called Kaneko Buneido to help support her young family. And Masasuke, the baby of the family, went to live with the childless Fuji and her husband in Shimonoseki as their son. Because Matsuzo wanted to raise Masasuke as his successor, it became an absolute secret between the two families that Masasuke was an adopted son. The sudden disappearance of her beloved father, followed by the sudden disappearance of her little brother, had a profound impact on Misuzu's mind. In 1916, when Japan was fighting on the side of Britain, France, and the USA in the First World War, Misuzu entered high school. 2 years later, as the war was ending, her aunt returned home to Senzaki for medical treatment and died a short time later. Misuzu was just 16. At this point, it is important to establish the cultural crosscurrents, promoting a great wave of new thinking in Japan, even in rural areas like Senzaki. In addition to modernist ideas flooding in from revolutionary Russia and Weimar Germany, American flappers were leading the charge towards sexual liberation. Perhaps this is why a family that fiercely protected its image of respectability by concealing Masusuke's true parentage now took a bold step. Fuji agreed to marry the widowed Matsuzo and moved to Shimonoseki, leaving Misuzu behind to finish high school in the care of her elder brother. By this stage, the elder brother was running the local family bookstore, but had no real interest in business. Instead, he and his younger sister had become part of a group of young people who were typical of the liberal movement, sweeping across Japan, sharing books and discussing new ideas. Among the new ideas gaining popularity was music and poetry written specifically for children. Well-known poets and writers, such as Kitahara Hakushu and Saijo Yaso, produced a succession of children's songs that are still sung today. It wasn't long before Misuzu was confronted with yet another disruptive shift in circumstances. Her elder brother got married, and his new wife didn't want to share their home with her studious sister-in-law. So, Misuzu also moved to Shimonoseki and began working in another Matsuzo's bookstore, Ueyama Buneido. She was surprised to discover that Masusuke, inspired by his visits to Senzaki and admiration for Misuzu's voracious appetite for books, had applied himself to studying musical composition. In this poem, we see the imaginative empathy and nuance that made Misuzu so popular with children and adults alike. And perhaps there's just a touch of homesickness for the everyday sights of a small fishing town.
At sunrise. Glorious sunrise. It's a big catch. A big catch of sardines. On the beach. It's like a festival. But in the sea, they will hold funerals for the tens of thousands dead.
Poems such as this were soon discovered, and she quickly became a star doyo poetry, emulated and admired by fellow contributors from all over the country. Inspired by this, Masusuke also began submitting his original songs to magazines, and in 1924, one of his works was selected for publication. Brother and sister spent hours together, sharing ideas about music, literature, and films on a daily basis. Meanwhile, Masusuke, who did not know that he was Misuzu's younger brother, began to develop a romantic interest in her. Worried about this, Misuzu's uncle, Matsuzo, sent his adopted son to Tokyo to train as a book trader, and began looking for someone for Misuzu to marry. Matsuzo turned his attention to a man called Miyamoto, who was an employee of his bookshop. Miyamoto had a history of working for a shady stockbroker as a teenager, and trying to commit suicide with prostitutes. But he was a business-minded, go-getter, and good-looking. In early 1926, Misuzu was back home in Senzaki when Masusuke came to visit her. Masusuke was very opposed Misuzu to marry with Miyamoto, who had rumors he had been spending lots of money on gambles and brothels yet. He called Misuzu to the beach and tried to ascertain her feelings. He asked, "Isn't there someone you like?" Misuzu answered, "That person is the one wearing black clothes and holding a long scythe." She was making a reference to the Grim Reaper. The comment would turn out to be prescient. Masasuke then asked her about his own parents. He had learned of his adoption by seeing his army draft papers. Misuzu told Masasuke that she was his sister. Such an awkward, cruel moment almost certainly convinced both siblings that no one had ever taken proper care of them.
Poor fish in the sea. Rice is grown by the hand of man. Cows are put in the pasture to graze. Koi carps also get bred on their pond. But the fishes in the sea never need to be taken care of. Never play tricks, not even one. And yet, they are eaten by me, like this. I really feel sorry for the fish.
As a parting gift, Misuzu gave her distraught brother 2 notebooks containing more than 300 poems, many of them unpublished. They also described family life in Senzaki after the young brother's adoption. A snapshot of the years with them that he had been denied. Misuzu had few friends as a child and played alone by the sea, in the fields and mountains. She didn't just observe nature, but used it as springboard into an imaginative fantasy world where her creative spirit could roam freely. For her, nature contained all the joy and sorrow of the human condition.
Deep down in the blue sky, like pebbles on the ocean floor, they lie submerged till dark comes. Stars unseen in the light day. You can't see them, still they're there. Even things not seen are there. Petals drop, and withered dandelions, hidden in cracks between roof tiles, wait silently for spring to come. Their strong roots, unseen. You can't see them, still they're there. Even things not seen are there.
In Japan, the magical transition between day and night is brief. Sunsets are fleeting. But clearly, this was Misuzu's favorite time of day. A suitably melancholy backdrop for her innate sense that life is absurd and requires compassion, especially for the poor, the weak, the lonely, the innocent, the useless, the forgotten, the dutiful but unacknowledged, even those who are positively disliked.
Snow on top. It must feel cold. The chill moon, shining down. Snow on the bottom. It must feel heavy. Hundreds of people on you. Snow in the middle. It must feel lonely. No earth or sky to look at.
In 1926, Misuzu surrendered to her stepfather's wishes and married Miyamoto. Matsuzo decided to let him take over running the business. Delighted, he threw himself into his work and tried very hard to live up to his father-in-law's expectations. But after returning home from Tokyo, Masasuke felt he was too pushy and aggressive, expressing sorrow for the sensitive, kind-hearted Misuzu. Masasuke and Miyamoto began to clash over everything, and the atmosphere in the bookshop became acrimonious. Finally, Masasuke left, and Matsuzo was upset, reprimanding his new son-in-law for driving away his adopted son. Misuzu stepped into the breach and calmly defended Miyamoto, whilst trying to mediate an uneasy peace between her brother, her uncle, and her husband. Unfortunately, her efforts only exacerbated the situation. Miyamoto became brazen and made no secret of bringing his mistress into the bookshop. For Matsuzo, this was the last straw. He sacked Miyamoto and recommended that Misuzu should file for divorce. As always, Misuzu saw everyone's perspective with equal clarity and compassion, making the whole situation unbearably painful for her. The bitter truth that the road to hell is paved with good intentions sank home.
White petals in the stings. Poor petals, you must get hurt. A gentle breeze, run to save them. Then the petals fell gently on the ground. White petals on the ground. Poor petals, you must be cold. The sun gently shine to warm them up. Then they turned brown. And then they died.
The news that she was pregnant banished any ideas about divorcing Miyamoto that Misuzu may have harbored. They moved into a small apartment, and Miyamoto began looking for another job. Struggling to make ends meet, Misuzu gave birth to a baby girl whom the couple named Husae. Masasuke continued to write to his sister, urging her not to be so absorbed by motherhood that she neglected her poetry. She took up her pen just long enough to respond.
Spread my arms, though I may. I'll never fly up in the sky. Songbirds fly, but they can't run fast on the ground like I do. Shake myself, though I may. No pretty sounds comes out. Bells jingle, but they don't know. Lots of songs I do. Bell, songbird, and me. All different. All good.
Misuzu's quiet resignation, her willingness to countenance reality, but still celebrate the joy of life in all its forms, could not sustain her through the next shocking twist in our tale. She had contracted gonorrhea from her philandering husband. Without knowing about his sister's situation, Masasuke could stand it no longer. Against all his father's objections, he moved to Tokyo and became a scenario writer.
If a child, without a toy, feels lonely, give him a toy. Then he will feel better. If a child, without a mother, feels sad, give her a mother. Then she will be happy. The mother gently strokes her hair. And toys are spilling out of his toy box. And my loneliness. What can heal my loneliness?
Sensing that his moment had arrived, Miyamoto forbade his wife from writing poetry and corresponding with her brother, her editor, and her colleagues. Perhaps, conscious of how it feels to grow up without a father, Misuzu obeyed her husband. Instead, she refined her past work in duplicate sets of notebooks. She then sent one set to Masasuke, the other set to Saijo Yaso. In 1930, her husband divorced her, and Misuzu took Husae to live with her grandmother at Ueyama Buneido. But it wasn't long before Miyamoto, with the law firmly on his side, began demanding the return of his daughter. The day before he came to pick up their daughter, Misuzu went to a photo studio to have her portrait taken.
When I'm feeling sad. Strangers don't know. When I'm feeling sad. My friends all laugh. When I'm feeling sad. My mother is very kind. When I'm feeling sad. Buddha feel sad.
That evening, she bathed her daughter as usual. And after watching her mother and Matsuzo put Husae to bed, she retreated to her room upstairs. Sitting down at her desk, she wrote 3 wills. In one, she urged her husband to give up custody of their daughter and allow her to be raised by her grandparents. To her mother and Matsuzo, she apologized for having failed to prevent her husband's excesses. And to Masasuke, she wrote words of encouragement, pleading with him to continue pursuing his dreams of being an artist in Tokyo and keep alive their family name. Having sealed the wills, she took an overdose of the sedative Carmotin, which had become a common method of committing suicide among writers. It was the 10th of March, 1930. In the aftermath of World War I, the West made very clear that it saw Asians in general, Japanese in particular, as genetically inferior. California even passed laws to prevent them owning land in a bid to stem immigration. This poured fuel on the fire of Japanese nationalists who were already alarmed by the free-thinking ideas of the Taisho period that threatened to topple absolute male authority and challenge the secretive elites who continue to hold sway in modern Japan. Perhaps it is no surprise then that Misuzu's work was forgotten for so many years, as the bid to forge dutiful and obedient citizens who would quietly serve the interests of the few, without question, took priority. It is easy to dismiss Misuzu's suicide as the culmination of a long series of domestic tragedies. But the fact that we know Carmotin was used by many writers to end their life suggests otherwise. There is a point in the rise of fearful prejudice when it threatens to drag us all back into savage destruction. That melancholy for a better world becomes something darker and insurmountable. Misuzu loved the work of English poet and free thinker Christina Rossetti, who, along with her husband and his fellow pre-Raphaelite artists William Morris and to some extent John Ruskin, challenged social convention. and the British Empire's singular obsession with material wealth. In her will to her husband, Misuzu expressed hope that her daughter would grow up in a way that fed her rich spirit, not just receive material provision. Nature, with which Misuzu had such an imaginatively romantic relationship, is now under threat and in turn threatens the existence of our children. And yet, the entire political spectrum still concerns itself purely with material concerns of one form or another. And populist prejudice is again on the rise as fear grows, and the juvenile battle for scraps begins again in earnest. After a global pandemic that is far from over, values are being reassessed, especially by the younger members of our societies. If ever there was a time that we needed a generous and empathetic wealth of spirit, it is now. And yet, the materialists continue to sow division, having forgotten the sheer richness and wonder of life itself that every child instinctively knows. Perhaps Misuzu can help them to rediscover it before it's too late.
If I say, "Let's play," "Let's play" comes back. If I say, "Stupid," "Stupid" comes back. If I say, "I'm not playing anymore," "Not playing anymore" comes back. Then afterwards, when I start feeling sad, "Sorry," I say, and "Sorry" comes back. Is that an echo? No. Not anybody.